welcome, and thank you for spending part of your night here. Wherever you are, and whatever the time is for you, you're welcome here. I'm glad you came. Tonight we're going to spend a few hours on the Great Wall of China. One cold autumn night about 400 years ago, that's all. So tuck in your blankets and let yourself get comfortable. There's nothing here you need to follow. No plot to keep hold of, no names to remember, no puzzle waiting at the end. There's only the wall in the dark and the men who kept watch on it and the slow turning of one ordinary night from dusk to dawn. If your attention drifts, let it drift. If you fall asleep before the sun comes up, that's exactly what this is for. The wall will keep its watch without you. We're standing on a part of the wall north of the old Chinese capital in a time called the Ming. It's the wall most people picture in their heads. Grey brick running along the tops of the mountains, one tower after another fading off into the dark. Much of the wall you can still visit today was built in these years. On this night, the brick is still new, the corners still sharp, and every tower still has men on it. It's late autumn. The first hard frosts have come. Far away to the north, out past where any lamp can reach, there are people the soldiers call the Jurchen. They've grown strong, and the men on this wall know the quiet times may be ending. But all of that is far off tonight. Here, there's only the cold, the stone, a small fire, and a long night to get through. We'll climb up onto the wall together as the last of the light goes, and we'll just keep watch, hour by hour, until morning. There's no hurry. There's nowhere else we need to be. The last of the daylight leaves the wall slowly, the way it always does up in the mountains. It doesn't so much fall as pull back, sliding up the slopes and off the tops of the towers, until only the highest ridge still holds a thin line of color. Everything below has gone to shadow and deep blue. The wall runs along the top of the ridge like it grew there. It follows every rise and dip in the rock, climbing where the ridge climbs, dropping down into the low places, curving around the shoulders of the peaks. From far off in this fading light, it's just a darker line drawn along an already dark edge, broken here and there by the square shape of a watchtower. Up close, it's a wide stone road running high above the world, wide enough for men to walk side by side, with a low wall on each side. The tower we've come to is a squat block of grey brick. It rises a little above the walkway. Inside, on the lower floor, there's room for a few men to sleep and get out of the weather. A stair leads up to the open top, where the watch is kept and where the signal fire waits, ready to be lit. Small slits in the thick walls look out to the north. From the top, on a clear day, you can see the wall run away in both directions until it turns into a thread and then into nothing. There's a certain feel to the cold up here as the sun goes down. All day the bricks have held a little warmth from the sun, and for a while you can still feel it if you lay your hand flat on the stone. But it fades fast. The wind up here has come a long way over open country, and it carries the first real cold of the season, the kind that finds every gap in your clothes and settles against your skin. Below the wall, on the sheltered side, the ground drops away into a fold in the hills. Down there is a little cluster of buildings, a walled yard, a few low roofs. That's the post where the soldiers of this stretch live with their families. A thin line of smoke rises from it, leaning in the wind. Someone down there is cooking the evening meal. The smell drifts up faintly, warm grain and smoke, and then the wind carries it off. Up on the walkway, nothing moves for a long moment. Then a figure appears, coming from the next tower, walking the wall in the slow, easy way of a man who has walked it 1,000 times and will walk it 1,000 more. He carries a spear over one shoulder and a small covered lamp in his other hand, not yet lit. He's coming to take up the night watch. Behind him, further off, another man follows. Then the wall is quiet again. This is the hour when the day people and the night people trade places. All through the daylight, the wall belongs to the ones who mend it and carry supplies along it. But as the dark comes down, all of that clears away, and the wall is handed over to the small handful of men who will hold it through the hours when nothing is supposed to happen. The whole huge effort of the frontier comes down, in the end, to a few pairs of eyes watching the dark. The last band of color goes out along the ridge. The first stars come out. The wall settles into its night shape, black brick against the darkening sky. And the watch begins. The men who keep this watch didn't choose the wall. Neither did their fathers. They were born to it. In these years, a big part of the army came from families that owed a soldier to the emperor forever. Once your family was on the list, that was that. When one man got too old, or was killed or died in his bed, a son or a brother or a nephew took his place. The duty passed down the family like a name. A household might have been marked for army service long ago, back in the early days, for reasons nobody alive could even remember. The children just inherited it, along with everything else their parents left them. So the man standing the first watch tonight is a soldier, because his father was a soldier, and his father before that. He grew up in the little garrison town below the wall with other soldiers' children, and the wall was the biggest thing in his whole childhood. He learned its towers the way other children learn the streets of their village. He knew which men to stay away from and which ones would share a bit of food. He knew which parts of the walkway went icy in winter and where the wind cut hardest through the gaps. On paper, these soldiers were sorted into neat units, every man counted, every post filled. In real life, the frontier was never that tidy. Families ran short of men. Some soldiers slipped away and were still written down as present long after they'd gone. Others were stand-ins, hired to take the place of the man who was really on the list but had paid someone else to do his time. The officers knew all of this and did the best they could with it, because an empty stretch of wall was far worse than one held by imperfect men. Life in these families was hard, and it was poor. The plan long ago had been for the frontier soldiers to grow their own food on land near the wall, so the government wouldn't have to feed them. It was a neat idea, and it never really worked. The land up here was thin and cold. The men were pulled away too often for building and for watch to farm it well. So they leaned on grain sent up from the richer lands to the south, on what little they could grow, and on whatever small trade the border allowed. Hard as it was a steady kind of life. A man knew what he was and what was expected of him. He knew the faces around him, because they were the same faces year after year, sons of the same families, marrying each other's sisters, burying each other's parents, standing the same watches on the same wall. The garrison wasn't only a military post. It was a town, with market days and festivals and arguments over water, and the soldiers were its people. The man on the wall tonight carries all of that up the stairs with him without even thinking about it. He isn't standing here for the emperor, whom he will never see, or for some grand idea. He's standing here because it's his watch. Because the men on either side of him are counting on him to stay awake. And because tomorrow one of them will stand a watch so that he can sleep. The whole giant machine of the empire, all its rules and orders and grand plans, comes down in the end to this: one ordinary man on a cold wall, doing what his family has always done. He reaches the top of the stair, sets down his lamp, and looks out at the dark hills. The night is his now. The wall isn't really one wall, it's a chain. And the thing that holds the links together is fire. All along the frontier, spaced out so a man could see from one to the next on a clear day, stand the signal towers. Some sit right on the wall, some stand out in front of it on high ground. Some sit back behind it, stepping inward so a warning can be passed from the very edge of the empire back toward the capital. Every tower keeps the makings of a fire ready, along with powder for the signal guns. And every watch knows the code, because a fire nobody can read is just a fire. The Ming had worked the signals out carefully. There were rules that said exactly what each one meant. It wasn't enough just to light a fire and hope the alarm spread. The size of the danger had to travel too, so that officers far away could tell how many men to gather and how fast. So the code matched fires and gunshots in set numbers. A small raiding party meant one fire and one shot. A bigger force meant two of each. A serious attack, thousands of men, climbed the count higher, fire on fire, shot on shot, until the biggest signal meant an army was on the frontier, and every post that could see or hear it had to wake. Think about what that meant in real life. A watchman on a far tower sees, right at the edge of what he can make out, a single point of light flare up on a tower to the east. A moment later, he hears the flat, far-off thud of one gun. He doesn't need a messenger. He doesn't need a written order. He already knows, in that instant, roughly what has happened and roughly how big it is. His job is to make the same signal, so the next tower sees it too, and the warning jumps west from tower to tower, faster than any horse could carry it. In a few hours, the news can run the whole length of a frontier that would take a rider many days to cross. At night, the fire is the message. By day, when flame would be lost in the glare, they used smoke instead, and the towers kept dry fuel ready, and other things that made the smoke rise thick and straight even in a wind. The signal guns worked day or night, their bang carrying the count when the eye might miss it, cutting through fog and distance the way light and smoke could not. Tonight, the fire pit on our tower sits cold, but ready. The fuel is laid. The tinder is kept dry under a cover, out of the frost. The watchman's most important job through the whole long night isn't to fight, and it isn't to stay warm, though he'll think about staying warm a great deal. It's to watch the towers on either side of him, and to be ready. If a light shows in the east, he has to see it. If a gun sounds, he has to count it. Everything else, the cold, the boredom, the aching feet, is just the price of being awake and watching when the moment comes, if it ever comes. On almost every night, it doesn't. He looks east along the ridge, to where the next tower is a darker shape against the stars, its little watchfire showing as a faint orange dot. Steady. He looks west, to the tower on that side, and finds its fire too, low and steady. All along the ridge both ways, though he can't see them all, the fires are there. A line of small flames strung across the mountains, each one a pair of eyes, each one waiting on the next. For now the whole chain is quiet, every link holding, every fire burning low and even, That, in the end, is what a good night on the wall looks like. Nothing passed along, just the fires, keeping each other company across the dark. Inside the lower room of the tower, out of the wind, the watch gets ready for the long hours. There's a small clay stove against one wall. A fire has been built up from banked coals, fed slowly and carefully, because fuel up here is never plentiful and the night is very long. The firelight moves on the brick, warm and shaky, gathering the little room into a circle of orange against the black cold pressing in through the slits. A pot sits near the coals, and the water in it is slowly coming to a boil, for tea and for warming the belly, which on a night like this is nearly the same thing. Just a shallow dish of oil with a floating wick, or a small covered lantern that can be carried up top without the wind blowing it out. The men light them from the stove and set them where they're needed, one below in the room, one shielded up on the platform. Oil, like fuel, is counted and rationed. Nothing up here is spare. Everything had to be carried up from somewhere lower and easier, and everyone knows what it costs to get it here, so the lamps burn no bigger than they have to. The food for the watch is plain. There's grain, mostly millet, which is what the north lives on, ground and boiled into porridge, or steamed stiff and eaten by the handful. There's salt, precious and carefully kept, and maybe a little pickled vegetable, sharp and sour, to wake up a mouthful of plain grain. There might be a scrap of dried meat for those who have it. And there's tea, pressed into hard bricks and shaved off a little at a time. The frontier soldier loved his tea, as much for the warmth and the break in the boredom as for the taste. A man could sit a whole cold hour over a bowl of it and feel he'd got through the hour. The food reached the wool through a long chain of work. The men on watch mostly never saw. Grain grown in the rich lands to the south was taken as tax, moved along rivers and canals, then hauled overland by cart and animal up into these hard mountains, passing through the hands of clerk after clerk, carrier after carrier, each one taking his share of trouble, and, often enough, a share of the grain too. By the time a sack got to the tower, it had come a long way and been counted many times. The soldiers grumbled, the way soldiers always have, about short measures and poor quality and late deliveries, and often they were right. But the grain came, more or less, most of the time. That steady, imperfect trickle was one of the quiet miracles that kept the whole frontier standing. Tonight there's enough. The porridge is thin but hot. The tea is bitter and good. The men eat without much talk, hunched close to the stove, the bowls warming their hands as much as their stomachs. One of them sets a portion aside, wrapped and tucked near the warm bricks, for the small hours when the cold is worst, when one hot mouthful can be the whole difference between a man who's just miserable and a man who's starting to fail. When they've eaten, the first watch takes a lamp and climbs the stair to the top. The others settle down to rest as best they can on the sleeping ledge, wrapped in whatever they have, close to the stove, close to each other, because the warmth of another body is nothing to turn your nose up at on a night like this. Above them, the watchman stands in the wind with his shielded lamp. Below them, the fire ticks and settles. And the long, even work of the night goes on. One man awake so the others can close their eyes, the way it's always been done up here, and the way it will be done again tomorrow. Run your hand along the top of the wall, if the cold will let you, and feel what it's made of. Here it's brick, grey and fired hard, laid in lines so straight and so tight that even now on this dark walkway, you can feel the care that went into it. the wall wasn't always brick. For most of the long history of walls in this country, the builders used whatever the ground gave them. They packed earth between wooden frames, layer on layer, until it stood up as a rampart. Or they piled stone where stone was easy to find. Those older walls, earthen and grey, ran across the north for hundreds of years, and bits of them still stand, worn down to soft ridges. But the Ming, when they rebuilt the frontier, used brick and cut stone for the most important stretches. And it's one of those stretches we're standing on tonight. Brick had to be made, and making it near the wall meant kilns. All along the frontier, the builders set up kilns to fire the huge numbers of bricks the work ate through, using clay from nearby and fuel hauled in. The bricks came out square and dense and tough, and some were even stamped with a mark showing the unit, or the kiln, or the year, so that if a brick was bad, someone could be blamed. The cut stone for the base and the facing came from quarries in the mountains, hacked out in great blocks and moved by muscle and beast and the slow, grinding labor of many hands. In cold, that must have been brutal. Holding it all together was the mortar, and here the builders did something that still surprises people. Along with lime, they mixed in a paste made from sticky rice, boiled up and blended in to make the mortar stronger and better at keeping out water. It sounds like something out of a tale, a wall glued together with rice. But it was real, sober practice, and the mortar it made was remarkably tough. It gripped the bricks so well that in many places the wall has held for hundreds of years against frost and root, and the slow, patient wearing of time. Stand here and think about what it took to put this under your feet. Every brick was dug as clay, shaped, dried, fired, cooled, carried, and laid. Every block of stone was cut and hauled and set. The mortar was burned from limestone and boiled up with grain that could have fed a family. And all of it happened here, in these mountains, in the wind and the cold, up at a height where just walking is tiring and just surviving the winter is an achievement. The men who built the wall are as nameless now as the men who guard it. Their names, if anyone ever wrote them down, wore away from the world long ago. But the work is still here. The work is their monument, grey and huge and lasting, running off over the ridgelines in the dark. The watchman doesn't think about any of this most nights. The wall is just the wall, the ground he stands on, as ordinary to him as the floor of a house is to the people who live in it. But now and then, maybe on a still cold night like this one, a man might lay his hand on the stone and feel the rough edge of the brick, and something might move in him. Some faint sense of all that effort frozen into the stone beneath him. All those vanished hands holding him up out of the dark. Then the wind gusts, and the moment passes, and he pulls his collar tight and goes back to watching the north, standing on the work of the dead without another thought. The night is split into watches, and trading one for the next is one of the small rituals that shape the hours up here. People in these times didn't measure the night in even hours the way we do. They split it into watches, 5 of them, dividing the stretch from dusk to dawn into equal parts. In winter, those parts grew longer, and in summer shorter, as the dark itself did. In the towns, drums and bells marked them, a drum tower beating the watchers out over the rooftops, so the whole sleeping city turned over to the same slow rhythm. On the wall, there were no big drums, but the watches were kept all the same, measured by how far the lamp had burned down, by the turning of the stars, and by the long trained sense a soldier gets for how much of a night has gone. When one watch ends, the man who stood it wakes the man who's next. A soldier pulled out of the warm sleeping ledge into the killing cold up top doesn't always come willingly. There's a low grumble back and forth, some shifting and muttering, before the new man is up and racked and climbing the stair with the lamp. The one coming off watch takes the still warm spot on the ledge, pulls his covers around him, and is usually asleep within moments, because a man who stood 2 hours in that wind has no trouble finding sleep. There's a formality to it too, beyond just the waking. On the wall, like at any guarded post, there were passwords and check words, ways of knowing that the shape coming towards you in the dark was one of your own, and that the man handing over the watch was really handing it over, and not just sneaking off early. A word might be asked for and an answer given, so that a figure looming up out of the black could be challenged before it got close. In a world with none of our small comforts, where a face was hard to make out by lamplight and a voice could be muffled by a scarf, these little rituals mattered. They were the difference between a real watch and just the appearance of one. The officers knew how the watch went slack in the small hours, and they guarded against it. Rounds were made. Someone might come along the wall in the dead of the night, tower to tower, checking that the men were awake at their posts and not slumped asleep by a dying fire. A man caught sleeping on watch was punished, sometimes harshly, because a sleeping watchman was a hole in the whole chain. A dark tower where a fire should be. A place the enemy could slit through. So even in the loneliest hour, when it seemed impossible anyone could be watching him, the chance of the rounds kept the man on his feet, stamping and blowing on his hands, fighting the terrible weight of his own eyelids. Tonight the first change goes smoothly. The word is given and answered. The new watchman climbs up into the wind, the old one goes down into the warmth, and the wall doesn't even notice. This is how the night gets crossed. Not in one long ordeal, but in a set of shorter ones, each man carrying his part and then passing it on, the watch moving from shoulder to shoulder like a load shared among friends, so nobody has to carry the whole of it alone. Above, the stars have turned a little. Below, the fire has burned lower. The porridge saved for later has gone lukewarm. And the second watch of the night begins, no different from the first, except that there's now a little less of the dark left to get through. Turn now and look out over the wall, to the north, into the country. This whole thing was built to watch. By day, from up here, the view runs a very long way. Ridge behind ridge, blue and then grey, and then just a paleness at the edge of what you can see. Past the last of the mountains, the land starts to open out and flatten toward the great empty spaces of the grasslands. By night, none of that is there. The north is just darkness, deeper than the sky, without a single light in the whole of it. The towns to the south would at least show a faint glow from all their fires. The country up beyond the wall shows nothing at all. It's empty in a way that's hard to picture if you've only known settled land, a huge cold openness where a man could ride for days and see no roof, no field, no wall, but this one at his back. That emptiness is the whole reason the wall is here. For as long as there had been an empire in the south, there had been peoples of the grasslands in the north. Herders and riders whose whole way of life was built on the horse and the herd, and moving with the seasons across the open land. They weren't the Empire's people and didn't want to be. Sometimes the two sides traded. Sometimes they raided each other. Sometimes there was war, big enough to shake whole dynasties. The line between the settled south and the moving north was the oldest, most stubborn fact of the region's whole history. The war was the settled world's answer to riders who moved fast, a way of turning a line on a map into a line on the ground, slowing the raider down, funneling him toward the guarded gates, buying time for the alarm to spread and help to gather. In these years, the shape of the danger was changing. The older soldiers had grown up watching for the horsemen of the grasslands, who raided for goods and captives and then rode off. But now, away to the northeast, in the forests and river valleys past the mountains, the Jurchen people had been pulled together into one strong state under a very able leader. And that state had begun to push hard against the frontier and had already dealt the Empire some heavy blows out beyond the wall. The men on this stretch were far from that fighting, which mostly fell to the east, but word of it had reached them, and it had changed the feel of the dark they watched. The north had always been dangerous. Now it felt like it had a purpose. Still, on this night, the dark holds nothing. The watchman leans on the cold brick and lets his eyes move slowly across the black country, not looking for anything in particular, because there's nothing to see, but keeping his gaze moving the way a good watchman does, so that if the smallest light or movement did show up, it would catch the corner of his eye. The wind comes up out of that darkness, having crossed all those empty miles, and it carries nothing but cold. No sound of hooves, no smell of smoke, no sign that anyone at all is out there sharing the night with him. It's a huge loneliness when you stand in it. One man on a wall looking out at a whole continent of dark, and yet it's a comfort too in its way. An empty north is a safe north. The watchman would far rather stand 100 nights staring at nothing than see, even once, the thing he's here to watch for. He turns his eyes east along the ridge to the next fire, just to see it burning, just to remember that he's one of a line and not truly alone. Then he goes back to the darkness, and the darkness gives him nothing, which is exactly what he's hoping for. Every tower is a small armory too, and the weapons kept here tell their own quiet story about the times. Ready in the room below, and carried up top by the watch, are the ordinary weapons of the frontier soldier. There's the spear, long and plain, the most reliable thing a man can hold. It needs no powder, no string, no thawing out. It's always ready, in any weather. There's the saber at the belt, single-edged and slightly curved for the close work a spear can't do. And there's the bow, though on a night like this, the bow is a difficult friend. The cold stiffens its horn and sinew, and frost can foul the string, so a good archer treats his bow gently in winter, keeping it out of the worst weather until he really needs it. But the weapon that had come to shake the frontier, and that was changing the whole way war, was fought in these very years, was the gun. The Ming armies used all sorts of firearms, from small handguns fired by one man to bigger pieces mounted on the wall, and the signal guns whose bangs carried the code across the mountains were cousins of these. Powder was made and stored and carefully kept dry, because damp powder was useless and wet powder was worse than none. On a frost night, keeping the powder and the fuse usable was one of the watch's quiet jobs. In these years, a new and frightening kind of cannon was coming into use along the northern frontier. Heavy guns cast in the Western style, longer and stronger and far more powerful than the old ones, able to throw a great ball a long way and do terrible damage. These were rare and prized, placed at the most important strong points and the big gate forts, not scattered along every mile of wall. And it was with guns like these, in these very years, that the Empire would give the enemy in the East one of its first real bloody noses. Our lonely little tower has nothing so grand. It has its spears and sabers and bows, its handguns and powder, its one signal gun ready up top. But the age of the big cannon had begun, and the men on the wall knew it, and knew that the long struggle in the north might come to turn on such things. There's a certain bond between a soldier and his weapons that has nothing to do with glory. On the wall, the weapons are tools, and like all tools, they're looked after with a plain, practical care. A spearhead is kept from rusting, a blade is kept from rusting, a bowstring is kept dry, a bow kept out of the frost, powder is kept dry above all else. None of this is heroic and none of it is exciting, but it's the difference between a weapon that works when the moment comes and one that fails. And the frontier had long hard memories of watches that failed for the want of exactly this kind of small, dull care. Tonight the weapons wait, the way they wait on nearly every night, unused. The watchman's spear leans against the wall within reach of his hand. His saber rides at his hip, so familiar he doesn't feel it anymore. Below, the bows and the guns and the powder rest in the room, ready and not needed. The great truth of frontier service, the one no story ever quite gets across, is that most of a soldier's life is spent not fighting, but waiting. Not using his weapons, but just keeping them ready for a moment that on any given night almost never comes. He checks out of long habit that his spear is close and his blade is loose in its sheath. Then he goes back to the darkness. The weapons sleep. The watch goes on. The cold is the real enemy of the night watch, steadier than any raider and always there. And most of the skill of getting through the dark hours is really the skill of handling the cold. By the deep of an autumn night up in these mountains, the cold has stopped being just uncomfortable and become a thing with weight to it, almost with a will of its own. It presses in from every side. It comes up through the soles of your feet from the frozen brick. It reaches down the back of your neck wherever there's a gap. It gets into your hands until your fingers go slow and clumsy, and into your face until your cheeks stiffen, and your words come out thick. The wind, which never really stops up here, drives it deeper, finding every seam and opening in your clothes and working the chill through to the skin. Against this, a soldier armors himself as best he can. Winter clothing on the frontier was built in layers, thick, padded coats stuffed for warmth, and for those who had it, felt. Felt is one of the old miracles of the cold lands, wool matted and pressed into a dense, warm cloth that the herders of the north had perfected long ago, and the settled world had gladly copied. Felt turned the wind. Felt held the warmth. A man wrapped well in padding, and felt, with something bound round his head and his hands and his feet, could stand a watching cold that would kill a poorly dressed man. So the wise soldier looked after his winter clothes, the way he looked after his weapons, because both were tools for staying alive. Even so, no clothing alone is enough on the worst nights, and the watch becomes a constant little war of movement against stillness. A man on watch can't pace far, since he has to keep his post and his view, but he stamps his feet to push the blood back down into them, swings his arms, blows into his cupped hands, shifts his weight from one foot to the other, tucks his fingers into his armpits when he can, and does 100 small restless things that together keep the worst of the freezing off. Standing perfectly still is the temptation and the danger. Stillness lets the cold win, so the watchman keeps moving in his small ways, a slow, endless shuffle against the dark, hour after hour, and always there's the fire to come back to. This is the great luxury of a tower over the open wall. The watch can be relieved into a room with a stove and a pot of something hot. When a man comes down half frozen, the first minutes by the fire are a pleasure so sharp it almost hurts. The heat pushing back into dead hands and feet with a fierce prickling ache before it turns to comfort. A bowl of hot tea held in both hands, the steam rising into a stiff face, is worth more than gold in that moment. The men treat the fire as the beating heart of the tower, and they tend it through the night with real care, feeding it just enough, never letting it die, because a tower with a dead fire on a night like this is a hard and dangerous place. There's a kind of wisdom the frontier taught about cold, a patience with it, an acceptance. The cold couldn't be beaten, only endured and managed, waited out until the sun came back to break it. The soldiers didn't rage against it. They dressed against it, moved against it, warmed themselves against it, and otherwise just bore it hour by hour, watch by watch, knowing for certain that every night, however cruel, ends. The dawn always comes. The sun always climbs, however weak, over the eastern ridges. The killing cold of the small hours softens, and another night has been survived. For now, though, the dawn is still a long way off, and the cold has the wall to itself. The watchman stamps his feet, pulls his felt tighter, and endures. News travels strangely on the frontier, and the men on the wall live at the far, thin end of a long line, where word comes slowly and often twisted out of shape. The big events of the age reached this tower late and in pieces. Away to the east and north, past the mountains, the enemy had risen and struck hard. Cities the men had heard of all their lives had fallen or been fought over. Armies had marched and been broken. But none of this came to the wall. The way it comes to us in a history book, clean and in order, with dates and numbers. It came as a rumor carried up with the grain carts, as something a courier let slip while changing horses at the post, as a story told by a man who had it from a man who had it from someone who might have been there. By the time it reached the tower, it had passed through many mouths, and each mouth had bent it a little, sharpening a fear here, softening a defeat there, until what the watchman knew of the war was more a feeling than a fact, a general sense of something heavy gathering in the northeast. This is how most people, through most of history, have known the events of their own time, not as clear reports, but as rumor and hearsay, drifting in from far off, impossible to check. The soldier on the wall had no way to learn the truth of a battle 300 miles away. He could only hear what reached him and weigh it against what he already believed, and against the faces of the men telling it. When a story was grim, he watched to see whether the officers grew tense, whether the rations changed, whether extra watches were set. He read the truth of the news, less from the words than from how it changed the small world around him. For all the twisting, the flow of news wasn't useless. Real information did move along the frontier, and the Empire went to great trouble to move it. Beyond the signal fires, which carried alarm, there were couriers and post stations, a relay system where written messages could be carried enormous distances at speed, riders swapping tired horses for fresh ones at fixed stations and pressing on. An order from the capital, or a report from a threatened stretch of war, could travel far faster than any ordinary traveler. The men on the wall stood near the ends of these threads, and when a courier did pass, changing his horse at the post below, the whole garrison would strain for a word of what he carried, though the courier himself often knew no more than that there was a sealed message in his bag, and he couldn't read it. So the tower lived in a strange state, both cut off and connected at once. The war in the northeast was very far away and very close at the same time. Far away in miles and in the men's daily lives. Close in the way it hung over everything, in the extra watchfulness the officers demanded, in the feeling the older soldiers had that the world their fathers had guarded was slipping away, and a harder one was coming. Tonight, no courier passes, and no rumor arrives. The news, such as it is old news, chewed over many times already, and the watch has nothing fresh to fear or wonder about. The war is out there somewhere in the dark, doing whatever it's doing, beyond anything the men on this wall can know. And they, for their part, do the only thing they can about events so far past their reach. They keep their watch, they tend their fire, they hold their small link in the long chain, and trust that all the other links are being held too by men just as cold and just as far from the center of things as they are. Below the wall, in the sheltered ground behind it, are the horses. And where there are horses on the frontier, there's always movement, always the chance of word arriving or word being sent. The garrison keeps its horses in stables and yards below the wall, out of the worst of the wind. On a still night, if the wind drops, the sounds of them drift up to the platform. The shift and stamp of a hoof on frozen ground, a low snort, the small settling noises of big animals resting in the dark. To a man on the cold wall, these are friendly sounds. They mean the garrison is down there, alive and breathing, that he's not as alone as the empty north would have him believe. The horse was the hinge the whole frontier turned on. It was the strength of the enemy, whose riders could cross ground at a speed no foot soldier could match. And so it was a big part of the Empire's answer too. The frontier armies needed horses in great numbers, for their own riders, for the couriers, for the endless hauling of supplies. Getting enough good ones was a constant headache, because the settled lands didn't breed horses as well or as cheaply as the grasslands did. So, in one of the frontier's many quiet ironies, the Empire often bought its horses from the very people it built walls against, trading tea and cloth and silver for the animals of the north at markets held at set places along the border. At the garrison post, the horses served the courier and the patrol above all. By day, riders went out along the base of the wall and through the passes, a moving watch to go with the fixed watch of the towers. Couriers came and went along the post roads, changing mounts at the station and pressing on. A fresh horse was a precious thing, kept ready for the moment a message had to move fast. Looking after the horses was serious work, because a courier system is only as good as the animals carrying it, and a frontier that couldn't move its news quickly was already half beaten. There's an old bond between soldiers and horses that needs no explaining to anyone who's known it. The men of the garrison knew their animals as individuals, the steady ones and the jumpy ones, the one that bit and the one that would follow a familiar man around like a dog. In the hard winters, the horses suffered like the men did, and were sheltered and fettered over, because a horse lost to cold or hunger was a serious loss, not easily replaced way out here. Their care was woven into the daily life of the post as deeply as the care of the wall itself. Tonight, the horses rest. No courier pushes through the dark. No patrol clatters out below the wall. The animals stand in their yard, tails to the wind, warm against each other, doing the patient waiting that horses do so well. Now and then one shifts, and the sound floats up, and the watchman on the platform hears it and is glad of it. This small proof of the living world at his back. He thinks, maybe, of a horse he knew as a boy, or of the courier who came through a few days back with a face like bad news, or of nothing at all, just letting the sound of the animals fold into the sound of the wind and the fire, all of it blending into the deep quiet of the night. The horses wait below, the watch waits above, and the wall holds them both, the still parts and the moving parts of the frontier, through the long turning of the dark. Somewhere in the middle of the night, the watch stops to eat, and the plain meal of the frontier soldier becomes, in the cold and the dark, something close to a small joy worth savoring. The food of the northern wool was not the food of the rich south, with its rice and its fish and its many fine dishes. It was hard country food, built on the grains that would grow in a short cold season and the things that would keep through a long winter. Millet was the heart of it, boiled thick into porridge or steamed into a coarse, dense bread, filling and plain, and always the same. There might be wheat, where you could get it, made into noodles or flat cakes cooked on a hot stone or the side of the stove. And there were the keeping foods, the ones the frontier lived on when fresh food was just a memory, salted and dried and pickled, made to last, made to travel, made to get you through the winter. Salt itself was a small treasure. It preserved the food that kept a garrison alive through the barren months, and it made the endless millet bearable, and the trade in it was controlled and taxed and fought over across the whole empire. A soldier guarded his share of salt. The sourness came from pickled vegetables, cabbage and radish, and whatever else could be packed away in the good season and drawn on through the bad, sharp and strong, and welcome against the plainness of the grain. Dried meat was a treat not every man had every day, tough and salty, chewed slowly to make it last. And over all of it, warming and reviving, was the tea. The tea came pressed into hard bricks, dense blocks that travelled and kept far better than loose leaf, shaved off a little at a time and boiled up strong. This brick tea was one of the great goods of the border trade, carried enormous distances into the grasslands, where the herders prized it just as much as the soldiers did. Along the wall, it was as much a part of a man's ration as the grain. A soldier coming off a freezing watch didn't care about the finer points of tea. He cared that it was hot, that it was strong, that it drove a little warmth into his middle and a little life back into his hands, and that for the few minutes he sat over it, the night was held off. There was a rhythm and a warmth to the shared meal in the tower that mattered as much as the food itself. The men gathered close to the stove, the light warm on their tired faces, and ate together in the easy near silence of people who've shared 1,000 meals like this and have no need to fill the quiet with talk. Someone might tell a scrap of the story, or grumble about the grain, or say nothing at all. The bowls warmed their hands. The steam rose. And for a little while the cold outside, and the war beyond the mountains, and the long hours still to come, all pulled back, and there was only the small circle of warmth, the plain hot food, and the company of men who knew each other down to the bone. These are the moments that hold a hard life together. Not the great events, which come rarely and pass fast, but the small, reliable comforts repeated night after night. The hot bowl, the shared fire, the familiar faces in the lamplight. A frontier soldier's life gave little in the way of ease, but it gave him this, and the men took it gratefully, knowing its worth in a way people with softer lives often don't. The meal ends. The bowls are wiped and set aside. One man rises, wraps himself, and climbs up into the wind again to take his turn on watch, carrying the warmth of the fire and the food with him, which will last him, if he's lucky, a little way into the cold before the night takes it back. Behind him the fire settles. The night goes on. A little more of it crossed. A little more of it still to come. Look up now, away from the dark ground, to the other great darkness overhead, which on a clear night up here is not dark at all, but packed and blazing with stars. Away from the towns, with their smoke and their many small fires, the sky over the wall on a cold, clear night is a thing most people who live under city lights will never see. The stars aren't scattered, they're heaped, layer on layer, the bright ones standing out sharp and the faint ones washing in between until the whole sky looks less black than silvery grey with the sheer number of them. The great pale river we call the Milky Way arches from one side of the sky to the other, and the longer you look, the more you find, down and down into the depths, until it seems there's no true darkness up there at all, only stars too faint or too far to see clearly. To the people of these times, the sky wasn't empty and it wasn't random. It was ordered, full, meaningful, mapped into figures and palaces that carried names and stories and, above all, importance. The court kept astronomers whose work was deadly serious because the heavens were believed to speak. Something unexpected in the sky, a comet, an eclipse, a strange lining up of the planets, was a matter of state, read as a comment on the doings of men and the fortunes of the dynasty. Even the calendar, the ordering of the year and the fixing of the seasons and festivals, was a great imperial duty, tied up with the emperor's very right to rule. The soldier on the wall knew none of the court astronomer's learning, but he knew the sky in his own plain way, the way country people and soldiers and sailors always have. He knew the bright stars and the shapes they made, the ones that stood over the north and turned slowly around the fixed point there while the rest of the sky wheeled beneath them. He knew how the great figures moved with the seasons, which belonged to the summer nights and which to the cold, clear nights of winter, so that one look up told him not just the hour, but the time of year. And he knew how to read the passing of the night from the turning of the stars, so that with no clock but the sky, he could tell how much of his watch had gone and how much was left. There's a certain companionship in the stars for a man alone on watch. They're the same stars his father watched from this same wall, and his father before him, and the herders out in the dark to the north, and the astronomers on their towers in the far-off capital, all of them under the one sky. The wars of men don't touch the stars. The rise and fall of dynasties, the enemy pressing on the frontier, the whole huge anxious business of the empire means nothing at all to the cold points of light overhead. They've turned through the same shapes over these same mountains since long before there was a wall, and they'll go on turning long after the wall is dust. There's something in that, on a lonely night, a man can find either bleak or strangely comforting. Often, in the small hours, it's both at once. The watchman tips his head back and lets his eye travel the great arch of it, finding the familiar shapes, reading the hour from their slow turn. The night, the stars tell him, is well past its middle now. The cold is deepening toward its worst, the way it always does in the hours before dawn. But the sky has turned as far as it's turned, and it will keep turning, and somewhere below the eastern ridges, still far off but no longer impossible to imagine, the sun is on its way. He lowers his eyes back to the dark north, the stars still blazing silently above him, and keeps his watch. Look along the wall now, east and then west, and think about the other towers, the whole strung out line of watches that this one is just a single part of. From the platform, on a clear night, you can see the neighboring fires, small steady points of orange marking the towers on either side, and beyond them, fainter, sometimes another, until the curve of the ridge or a fold in the valley hides the rest. But the watchman knows they're there, tower after tower, fire after fire, running off over the mountains both ways, further than any eye could follow, each one keeping its own small watch just as he keeps his. The wall isn't something one man guards. It's something thousands of men guard, each one responsible for his own short stretch, each one trusting the men beyond him to hold theirs. There's a deep comfort in this, and a deep responsibility too. The comfort is in the company. The knowledge that all along the dark frontier there are other men awake in the same cold, tending the same kind of fire, watching the same kind of darkness, sharing without a word the same long night's work. A watchman feeling the loneliness press on him has only to look east or west to the next fire to be reminded that he's one of a great fellowship of the sleepless, spread across the mountains, holding the line together. The responsibility is the other side of the same coin. His fire is to the towers beside him exactly what their fires are to him, a sign that the watch is kept, that the link holds. If his fire were to die, if his tower went dark, the men on either side would see it and wonder and grow uneasy, because a dark tower is a break in the chain, a place where something might have gone wrong. So the fires talk to each other across the dark all night in the simplest language there is. Each burning point says only one thing over and over, but it's the thing that matters most. I'm here. I'm awake. The watch is kept. All is well. A watchman glancing at his neighbor's fire and finding it steady and bright, reads that message and is reassured, and knows his own fire is sending the same message back. In this way, the whole long wall, without a word spoken, without a single order given, holds itself together through the night. Tower confirming tower. Fire answering fire. The reassurance passing endlessly up and down the line. It's worth stopping on the size of it. This one tower, this one small fire, this one cold man stamping his feet up top is repeated hundreds upon hundreds of times across a frontier that runs almost too far to imagine across the north of the empire. On this very night, The same scene is playing out in 1,000 places. The same fire, the same wind, the same darkness watched, the same slow crossing of the hours. The wall is one of the biggest things people have ever built, and yet at any given moment it comes down everywhere along its length to this: one watchman, one fire, one patch of dark. He looks west to the other, the same. All along the ridge, though he can't see them, the fires are burning, the watches are kept, the links are holding. He adds his own small light to the great chain of them and takes his place among the awake, and for a moment the loneliness lifts, and he feels himself part of something huge and old and lasting, running off into the dark both ways, holding the long frontier together one fire at a time. The wall a man stands on is never quite as young as it looks. Beneath it and behind it lie the traces of older walls, older efforts, older frontiers, layer on layer of the same long labor repeated down the centuries. The idea of walling off the north was already very old by the time these Ming bricks were laid. Long before this dynasty, other rulers in other ages had thrown up their own barriers across the same country, walls of packed earth and piled stone following much the same logic, along much the same lines, because the land that made a frontier necessary here didn't change when the rulers changed. The mountains stood where they'd always stood. The passes opened where they'd always opened. The grasslands lay to the north as they always had. So ruler after ruler, facing the same problem, landed on the same answer and built along the same key lines, until the frontier became a kind of layered record. New walls raised where old walls had stood, old walls robbed of their stone to build the new. The Ming Wall, grand and unbroken as it was in one sense just the latest and greatest version of a very old idea. In places, it followed the lines of far older walls. In places, the earthworks of vanished dynasties still ran across the land nearby, worn down over the centuries to soft grassy ridges, barely recognizable as the work of human hands, their stone long since carried off or crumbled away. A soldier who knew his stretch of country well would know these old lines. He'd know that the low swelling in the ground over there was the ghost of some earlier wall, and maybe he'd grown up with tales of who built it and when, tales gone vague and half legend with the passing of the generations. Even within the Ming years, the wall was never truly finished, because a wall isn't something you build once and leave. It's something you build and then mend forever. Frost cracks the mortar. Water seeps in, freezes, and splits the stone. Roots pry at the joints. The ground shifts. Sections slump and have to be rebuilt. Facings fall away and have to be replaced. And the whole huge thing demands endless repair just to stay standing. The men of the wall lived among this constant mending. The work gangs coming up to patch and rebuild, the older repairs easy to tell from the newer, the whole rampart a record in brick and stone of many hands over many years, each generation adding its own work to the work of those before. There's a certain feeling that comes over a thoughtful man standing in a place like this in the dark, a sense of the depth of time beneath his feet. He's only the latest in a very long line to stand watch on this frontier. Before him, on this very ground or ground very near it, other men in other centuries stood their own cold watches, wrapped in the clothes of their own age, watching the same north for their own version of the enemy, under these same turning stars. And yet the thing they did lives on in the thing he's doing. The watch handed down across the ages like the wall itself, rebuilt and rebuilt but never given up. The watchman, of course, doesn't think any of this in so many words, but standing on the old brick in the deep of the night, he may feel it dimly all the same. The weight of all those banished watches beneath his own. The long inheritance of standing guard on this line between the settled and the wild. He isn't the first. He won't be the last. He's just the one whose turn it is now, holding the frontier for his own short span exactly as others held it before him. And the wall beneath his feet, layered and mended and endlessly old, holds the memory of all of them, silent under the stars. Go still for a while now, and just listen, because the night on the wall is never truly silent, and its sounds, once a man learns them, become as familiar as the face of a friend. The first and biggest sound is the wind. It's almost never gone up here on the top of the mountains, and it has many voices. It hums low and steady across the open stretches of the walkway. It rises to a thin whine where it squeezes through a gap in the wall or a narrow slit. On the worst nights, it booms and slams against the tower, shouldering at the brick. But on a night like this, it's gentler, a long continuous breathing across the stone, rising and falling, never quite stopping, the great steady note underneath every other sound. Inside and against the wind, the watchman hears the smaller sounds, and a lot of the skill of the watch is in telling the ordinary ones from the ones that matter. There's the ticking and settling of the tower itself, the small sounds a mass of brick and stone makes as it gives up the last of the day's warmth to the cold, shrinking a little, a creak, a tick, a whisper of grit. There's the fire below, its soft collapse and flare, the sigh of a settling coal drifting faintly up the stair. There are animal sounds when the wind lets them through, the distant shift of the horses in the yard, and now and then, out in the dark, the call of an owl or some other night creature, sharp and startling against the wind's steady hush, before the silence closes over it again. To an untrained man, all these sounds might blur into one anxious sameness, every creak a possible enemy, every distant call a reason to worry. But the seasoned watchman has heard them all 1,000 times, and his ear has learned to hold them without alarm, to know the settling of the brick and the sigh of the fire and the call of the owl for what they are, the ordinary furniture of the night. He doesn't waste his fear on these. He saves it for the sounds that don't belong. And the whole point of knowing the night's ordinary voices so well is exactly this, so that a wrong sound, if it ever came, would stand out against them at once, sharp and clear, impossible to miss. There's a deep quiet that settles on a man who's learned to sit inside the sounds of the night instead of fighting them. He stops straining. He lets the wind and the ticking brick and the far-off owl wash over and around him, there but not alarming, and in that state a kind of peace can come even in the cold and the dark. A wakeful, restful kind of attention, alert but not tense, the mind quiet, the ear open. The old soldiers had this. They could stand a long watch in what looked like perfect stillness, and yet miss nothing. Their awareness spread out into the dark around them, riding on the sounds, ready. And there are the silences too, the moments when the wind itself drops for a breath, and the whole night seems to hold still. And everything goes so quiet, a man can hear his own blood, and the small sounds of his own body, and the vast dark country to the north seems to press in with all its emptiness. These sudden stillnesses can be unnerving, or they can be beautiful, or both. Then the wind comes back, taking up its long breathing again, and the night settles back into its familiar voice, and the watchman lets out a breath he didn't know he was holding, and eases back into the listening. Nothing wrong sounds tonight. Only the wind, the settling brick, the fire, the horses, the far-off owl, the ordinary chorus of a quiet night, over and over, wrapping the tower in its familiar music. The watchman listens and hears nothing that doesn't belong. And that, in the language of the night watch, is the sweetest sound of all. Sometime in the depths of the night, along the walkway, comes a small disturbance of the officers' rounds, and with it a reminder that even out here, at the far edge of everything, the Empire keeps its records and its order. The officer moves from tower to tower through the dark, a lamp in his hand, checking that the watches are kept, that the men are awake at their posts, that the fires are burning and the signals stand ready. His coming is announced by the challenge and the answer. The shape looming up out of the black, the word asked and given. Then the officer is there on the platform, stamping the cold from his feet, trading a few words with the watchman, running an eye over the readiness of the tower. It's a small thing, a brief thing, but it's the visible edge of a vast unseen structure. The discipline and the record keeping that held the whole frontier together. Because the empire ran on paper as much as it ran on brick, and the wall was wrapped in records. Somewhere in the garrison there were registers of the men and their families, of the rations handed out and the powder stored, of the watches kept and anything that happened, of the repairs made and the materials used. Officers wrote reports and sent them up the long chain of command toward the capital, where clerks and ministers pored over the numbers, made their decisions, and sent orders back down. The soldier on the wall lived at the very bottom of this great pyramid of paper, mostly unaware of most of it, but shaped by it in 100 ways, in the ration he got, the post he was given, the punishment he'd face if he was caught asleep on watch. This hunger for records was one of the deep habits of the Empire, and it reached even the loneliest tower. Tonight's watch would, in the ordinary way of things, leave some trace in the accounts, a note that the watch was kept and nothing happened, folded into the endless routine paperwork of the frontier. It's a strange thought that the utterly ordinary nights, the huge majority of nights, when nothing at all happened, were themselves written down. That somewhere a clerk noted the nothing, the quiet, the absence of any event, and that this too was part of the great machine. But so it was. The Empire wanted to know its wall was watched, and being watched meant being able to show on paper that it was watched night after uneventful night. There's something almost touching in this. The vast, plodding empire, reaching all the way out to a cold tower on a dark ridge to make sure its record was complete. That even here, the forms were kept and the watch accounted for. It tied the lonely soldier to the far-off capital in a way the signal fires and the couriers did too, but more quietly, more personally, because it meant that his ordinary night, his cold and his fire and his watching of the dark, was in some small way known to the great structure above him, folded into its endless memory, counted. The officer, his check done, gives a word of acknowledgement, maybe a gruff remark about the cold, and moves on to the next tower, his lamp shrinking away along the walkway until it vanishes around the shoulder of the ridge. The watchman is alone again, but a little less alone for the visit, reminded that he's watched over even as he watches, that his lonely vigil is part of a larger order that hasn't forgotten him. He settles back to the dark. The rounds may come again before dawn, or they may not. Either way, the record will show that the watch was kept on this tower, on this night, just as it was meant to be. The wall split two worlds, but it never sealed them apart. Along the frontier, the settled south and the roaming north met not only in war, but in trade, and the border was as much a place of exchange as of conflict. At set places along the frontier, at certain gates and market grounds, the two worlds came together to do business. The people of the grasslands wanted the goods of the settled empire, and most of all they wanted three things: tea, cloth, and grain. The tea especially, because a diet built on meat and milk craved it, and brick tea from the south became one of the great currencies of the border. The empire, for its part, wanted the horses of the north, those fast, strong animals. The settled lands couldn't breed in enough number or quality, and it wanted the other goods of the herds too, the hides and the wool and the felt. So, in the gaps between wars, and sometimes even in the shadow of one, the markets were held, and horses were traded for tea and cloth. And the wall that was built to keep the two worlds apart became, at these few points, the very seam where they were stitched together. These border markets were tightly controlled, because the empire was careful about what crossed the line and to whom. Certain goods were watched or banned, iron and weapons above all, in case the trade ended up arming the very people it was meant to calm. Officials ran the markets, taxed them, tried to fix the prices and controlled who took part, and used the trade itself as a tool. They'd open the markets to reward good behavior and close them to punish raiding, because the northern peoples had come to depend on the exchange, and the threat of cutting it off was a real lever. Trade, in other words, wasn't the opposite of the frontier's military purpose. It was part of it, another way the empire tried to manage its difficult neighbors. For the ordinary people of the border, the markets meant a mixing that the grand strategy of walls could never fully stop. At the market grounds, men of the settled world and men of the grasslands stood face to face, haggling, sizing each other up, doing the small human business of trade. In the border towns, the two ways of life blurred into each other more than the sharp line of the wall would suggest. There were men who spoke both tongues, who moved between the worlds, who married across the line, whose loyalties were as mixed as the frontier itself. The border wasn't a clean edge, but a wide zone of mixing, and the wall ran right through the middle of a world that was, in its daily life, far more tangled and connected than any map could show. The soldier on the wall was part of this mixed world, whether he thought about it or not. The tea he shaved into his pot might have come from the same trade that fed the grasslands. The horse in the yard below him might have been bought at a border market from the very people he stood guard against. The felt that kept him alive in the winter cold was the North's own invention, borrowed by the settled world long ago. Even as he watched the North for enemies, he was clothed and warmed and supplied in part by goods and ideas that crossed the very line he was defending. The frontier was never simply us against them. It was always, also, a place where the two became tangled together, trading, borrowing, lending. Tonight the markets are far away, and the trade is only a fact of the daylight world, no part of the dark watch. But the watchman, warm in his northern felt, drinking his southern tea, guarding against the people whose horses fill the yard below him, carries the tangle in himself without knowing it. The wall at his back says the worlds are separate. The things around him say they never quite were. And the night holds both truths at once, the way the frontier always did. Behind every soldier on the wall stood a family in the garrison town, and behind every family a whole web of small lives. The frontier wasn't only a line of defense, it was a place where people were born and married and grew old. An ordinary human world lived out in an extraordinary place. The soldier families weren't lone men, they were households, and the garrisons weren't only barracks but communities, with women and children and the old, with all the fabric of ordinary life. In the town below the wall, wives kept house and raised children and tended whatever gardens the short seasons allowed. Children were born who would grow up to inherit the same service their fathers carried, raised in the shadow of the wall as the great fact of their world. Marriages were made, most often within the community of soldier families, tying the garrison together into a dense web of kinship, so that the men who stood watch together were very often also cousins and brothers, in-law and old childhood friends, bound by blood as much as by duty. A soldier's thoughts on a long night watch turned often enough to this world at his back, to the warm rooms below where his family slept, to a wife, a child, an aging parent. Much of what made the hard life bearable was there, in the human warmth of the town, in the family that gave the cold, abstract duty of guarding the frontier a real and personal meaning. He didn't stand the watch for the emperor, whom he'd never see. He stood it, in the end, for the sleeping town below him, for the people whose lives depended on the wall holding, and among those people were his own. For those whose families were far away, back in the interior, separated by the great distances of the empire, there was the letter, that thin, precious thread across the miles. A soldier posted far from home might send and receive letters carried along the same post roads as the official messages, though far slower and far less surely. And the letter from home was an event of huge weight, read and reread, carried against the body, a piece of the lost world of family in place. Many soldiers couldn't read, and leaned on others to read a letter aloud and to write down their replies, so that the private business of a family's news passed through the hands of a scribe. And yet even so, the letters carried across the empire their load of longing and reassurance, of births and deaths and harvests and small daily doings, tying the scattered families of a vast land together across distances that could otherwise swallow a man whole. There's a particular tenderness in the family life of the frontier, this ordinary human warmth set down in so hard and dangerous a place. The children who played in the garrison town, the couples who married, the old people who died in their beds below the wall, all lived lives shaped at every turn by the grim purpose of the place, and yet lived them fully, with all the love and quarrel and hope and grief of any human community anywhere. The wall was a machine of war, but the people who kept it were not machines. They were families, living out their lives in the one place the empire had put them, making a human world in the shadow of the enormous stone. The watchman, high on the cold platform, looks down at the dark town below, where a single late light shows in one window and then goes out. Someone banking a fire, settling a child, going at last to sleep. He thinks of the warm room and the sleeping family, so near and so far, just below him in the dark. He pulls his felt tighter and turns back to the north. He's cold and the night is long, but the town sleeps safe below him, and that, more than any order from any far-off throne, is what keeps him at his post. Now the night reaches its deepest part, the long, still stretch of the small hours, when the fires have burned low and the whole world seems to have stopped, and getting through the dark asks the most of the men who have to get through it. There's an hour in every night well past the middle, before any hint of dawn, when time itself seems to thicken and slow. The evening is long gone, and the morning is not yet even imaginable, and the watch stretches out ahead and behind with no end in sight. The cold has reached its deepest bite. The fires are burned down to their lowest, kept just barely alive, banked against the long hours still to come. The horses are still. The wind has often dropped to its faintest. Even the owl has gone quiet. The whole night holds a great stillness, and in that stillness a man on watch has to find, somewhere, the will to stay awake. This is the hour the discipline of the watch was built for. Anyone can stay awake in the first hours, with the evening meal warm inside him and the night still young. It's here, in the dead stretch of the small hours, that the watch is really tested, when the body screams for sleep, and the cold saps the will, and the mind goes dull and heavy, and the sleeping ledge below, with its warmth and its rest, calls with an almost unbearable sweetness. Here the watchman fights his real battle, not against any enemy from the north, but against his own exhausted body, against the terrible dragging weight of his own eyelids. And he fights it with all the small weapons the old soldiers taught: movement, cold air, the fear of the rounds, and plain stubborn will. The old hands knew this hour and knew how to cross it. They kept moving, always moving, the small endless stamping and swinging that pushed back both the cold and the sleep. They ate the mouthful of food saved from the meal, the porridge gone cold now, but still a little fuel against the dark. They fixed their minds on things, counted the stars, told themselves stories, ran back over memories, anything to keep the mind turning and awake. And above all, they held on to what they'd learned over many nights, that this hour, however endless it felt, would pass, that the dead stretch had a far side, that if a man just endured, just stayed on his feet and kept his eyes open, the night would, in the end, begin to turn toward the dawn. There's an odd quality to the mind in these hours, a thinning, a strange clearness that comes with exhaustion and cold and being alone. The mind, stripped of the day's busyness, hollowed out by tiredness, goes strangely open. Thoughts float up on their own, memories, faces, pieces of the past, and the watchman, moving slowly on his platform under the blazing stars, may find himself far away inside his own head, even as his eyes keep their mechanical watch on the dark north. The old soldiers spoke sometimes of the strange thoughts of the small hours, the things that came to a man alone on the wall in the dead of the night, and there was a kind of wisdom in it, a night wisdom, hard to carry back into the daylight, but real all the same. And still the stars turn, slowly, without seeming to move at all, and still the night deepens toward its coldest point, and then, though no one can feel the exact moment, tips over some hidden edge and begins, at last, to turn toward morning. It is only the slow, blind endurance, and then, at some point, the first faint sense that the night has begun, ever so slightly, to age. That the darkness is old now, rather than young. That somewhere below the eastern horizon, still completely out of sight, The sun has started its long climb back toward the world. The watchman doesn't know it yet. He knows only the cold and the dark and the long work of staying awake. But the night has turned. The worst is, though he can't feel it already behind him, he stamps his feet, pulls his felt close, and endures. And the endurance, though he doesn't know it, is now carrying him not deeper into the dark, but slowly, slowly, back out toward the light. In the long dark of the small hours, a man's mind turns easily to the unseen, and it's worth remembering that the soldiers of the wall lived in a world thick with gods and spirits and small acts of devotion, and they carried their beliefs up onto the cold stone with them. The religious world of the frontier wasn't one tidy faith, but a rich mixing, layered and practical, drawing on many streams. There were the great traditions with their temples and their scriptures. But woven all through daily life, there was also a dense fabric of local gods and household spirits, and protecting powers worshipped not as far off ideas, but as real, present forces that could be asked for help in a hard and dangerous world. A soldier facing all the dangers of frontier service, the enemy, the cold, the accidents, the sicknesses, had every reason to seek whatever protection the unseen world might offer, and he did it as naturally as he tended his fire. Among the gods of the settled world were the guardians of walls and moats, the protecting spirits of cities and their defenses, given offerings, with shrines standing in the towns. It made sense, on a frontier built around walls, that such guardians should have their place, and the people of the garrison towns would have known these protectors and turned to them, seeking safety for the community they watched over. There were gods of war and of soldiers that fighting men naturally looked to. There were spirits of particular places, of mountains and rivers and passes. And there were the ancestors, always present, owed respect and remembrance, watching over their descendants from beyond death, so that a soldier was never quite alone, even on the loneliest watch, because the dead of his family were believed to be near. These beliefs weren't, for the most part, matters of deep religious study. They were practical, woven into the rhythm of life, shown in small daily acts, an offering, a bow, a muttered prayer, a little incense, a festival at its proper time. A soldier might carry some small token of protection, might mutter a word to a guardian spirit before a dangerous duty, might leave a small offering at a shrine in the town before going up to a hard watch. None of this seemed strange or unusual. It was simply how you lived in a world understood to be full of unseen powers, some dangerous, some protecting, all of them to be reckoned with. It was peopled, in his understanding, with powers and presences, and so was the wall beneath him, and the town below, and the very air around him. He was watched over, even as he watched. The guardian of the walls kept its own watch alongside his. The ancestors were near. Whatever happened to him was part of a meaningful whole, not just a random cruelty in an empty universe. This didn't make the cold any less cold or the enemy any less dangerous, but it set a man's hardship inside a frame that gave it sense, and that frame was itself a kind of shelter, as real in its way as the felt against the wind. The watchman, alone in the deep of the night, may murmur something to himself, a half prayer, a word to a guardian or an ancestor, barely aware he's doing it, a small reaching out toward the unseen protectors of a dangerous world. It costs him nothing and it steadies him. The stars turned overhead, which the astronomers read as signs, and the priests as the homes of powers, and the soldier simply as the beautiful cold company of the night. And the dark north, which holds the enemy, holds also in his understanding the guardians and the spirits and the watching dead, so that even here, even now, even alone, he isn't, in the deepest sense, alone at all. The coldest hour of the night isn't the darkest, but the one just before the light, and it's in this hour, with the frost at its hardest, that the watch feels the deepest chill, and the first faint promise of the dawn. There's an old truth known to everyone who's ever kept a night vigil in a cold country. The cold doesn't lift the moment the night starts to age, just the opposite. The hardest cold comes late, in the still, clear hour before the first grey shows in the east, when the earth has given up all the warmth it held and the frost settles at its very worst. On a clear night up here, this is the hour when water freezes hardest, when your breath hangs and crackles, when the bare brick of the wall grows so cold it seems to burn the hand you lay on it, when your face goes numb and your fingers, even wrapped, lose their feeling. It's a bitter joke that the coldest hour comes just as the night is ending, but that's how it is, and the watch has to be carried through it all the same. The frost changes the wool in this hour. Wherever a little moisture has gathered, on the stone, on the men's clothes, on the felt and the wood, a thin coat of white forms, covering the world in a faint, ghostly fur that the starlight catches. The watchman's own breath freezes on the scarf across his face, and on his brows and lashes, so that by the deep of the night a man on watch may be silvered over with frost, a pale figure moving slowly up top. The whole wall, the whole mountain, lies stiff and glittering under the hardest grip of the cold, completely still, the very air seeming frozen in place. And yet it's in this bitter hour that the first sign comes. The watchman, glancing east as he's glanced east 100 times through the night to find only stars and darkness, notices at last, low on the horizon, the faintest possible change, not light, not yet, but a thinning of the black, a place where the darkness of the earth and the darkness of the sky begin, ever so slightly, to pull apart. It's the first grey, the earliest sign of the dawn, so faint that at first he can't be sure he sees it at all, so faint that he looks away and looks back to test it. But it's there. The night has a bottom after all, and he's reached it, and he's climbing out. There's a particular feeling in that first sight of the coming lights after a long cold watch, a feeling that anyone who's never kept such a vigil can hardly imagine. It's relief, of course, the deep animal relief of a creature that has come through the dark and the cold and now sees the promise of their end. But it's more than relief. It's a kind of quiet joy, a lift of the spirit, a sense of having made it, of having held on through the worst and won. The dawn, to a man who's watched all night for it, isn't just the start of a day. It's a rescue, arriving the way it always arrives, faithfully, on time, no matter how endless the night had seemed. The cord doesn't lift with that first grey. In fact, the coldest minutes may still be ahead, because the hard chill lingers even as the light starts to grow. But something has changed all the same, because now the watchman endures with hope instead of in the depths, knowing that every passing minute brings the light nearer, that the dark is spending its last and can't hold. He stamps his feet, frost-silvered, aching, worn out, and watches the faint ray in the east strengthen so slowly, and feels rising in him against all the cold, a quiet gladness, because the long night is ending, and he has kept his watch, and the morning is coming, the way it always comes, over the eastern ridges of the world. Now the light comes in earnest, and the great dark country to the north, which held nothing but blackness through all the long hours, slowly begins to sort itself out of the night and take back its shape before the watchman's eyes. The dawn doesn't arrive all at once. It builds by tiny steps, so slowly that a man watching can't catch the moment of any change, and yet, glancing away and back, always finds that a little more has come. The first faint grey in the east strengthens and spreads, climbing the sky, washing out the lowest and faintest of the stars. The hard black of the mountains softens toward a deep charcoal, then a cold grey, and the ridge lines that were lost in the dark begin to draw themselves in, again against the paling sky, the near ranges first, and then, further and further off, the fainter shapes behind them, the whole vast folded country of the north coming out of the retreating night fold by fold. There's a great stillness to this hour, a held breath between the dark and the day. The wind, which so often drops in the small hours, may lie quiet now, and the frost holds hard, and the slowly appearing land lies stiff and colorless and completely silent under the growing light, a world of grey on grey, beautiful and severe. The watchman, worn out, frost-rimed, watches the country he's guarded all night, without seeing slowly show itself, ridge by ridge, and finds it, the way he's found it every dawn, empty, silent, still, holding no enemy, no movement. Nothing but the cold grey mountains stretching off into the north, exactly as they always have. And then, into the great silence of the dawn, come the first sounds of the returning day. A bird, somewhere below the wall, or out in the frozen country, gives its first uncertain call into the grey, and then another, and the silence that held all night begins to break softly into the small, ordinary music of morning. In the town below, the first thread of new smoke rises as someone wakes and stirs a fire, and the faint sounds of the garrison starting its day drift up to the platform. A voice, a door, the shift of the waking horses. The world, which through the long dark hours seemed to have stopped entirely, turns out to have only been sleeping, and now it wakes, unhurried, into the cold, clear light of the new day. Color comes back last of all. For a long time the appearing world holds only greys, and then, as the light grows toward true dawn, the first faint warmth touches the highest peaks, a paleness, a hint of gold on the topmost ridges where the coming sun will strike first, while the valleys still lie in cold grey shadow far below. The watchman, looking east, sees the sky there slowly flush with the colors of dawn, and knows the sun itself is very near now, climbing the far side of the world toward the ridgeline, and that in moments the first true light will break over the mountains, and the long night will be, at last, and finally, over. There's no triumph in it, no drama, only the quiet, enormous fact of the morning arriving the way it has arrived every day since, long before there were men to watch it. The watchman has done nothing heroic. He has simply stayed awake and cold and watchful through the dark, as thousands of others did along the wall on this same night. And now his reward is only this, the ordinary miracle of the dawn, the grey country coming into shape, the birds waking, the smoke rising, the peaks catching their first pale gold. But to a man who's watched all night for it, that's reward enough, and more than enough. And he stands in the growing light, tired beyond words, and watches the world come back and is content. And so the sun comes up over the great wall, and the night watch ends, and the wall is handed on from the men of the dark to the men of the day, the way it's been handed on every morning for as long as there's been a wall to keep. The first true light breaks over the eastern ridges, and it doesn't come gently. It comes as a sudden clean brightness, the edge of the sun clearing the mountains and throwing long gold light across the tops of the towers and down the length of the walkway, so that the whole wall, grey and cold all night, is washed all at once in warmth and colour. The frost that silvered the world begins, wherever the light touches it, to soften and glitter and fade. The peaks blaze. The valleys, still in shadow, hold their cold a while longer, but the day has come unmistakably, fully, and the long reign of the night is broken. For the watchman, the coming of the light means the coming of relief in both meanings of the word. The night watch is ending, and the men of the day are stirring, and soon someone will climb the stair to take over the tower, and the worn-out watchman will be free at last to go down, to the warmth, to food, to the deep sleep his body has been crying out for all through the long cold hours. There's a particular tiredness that comes at the end of a night watch, a bone-deep weariness mixed with the strange lightheadedness of having crossed the whole night awake, and mixed too with the quiet satisfaction of a duty done, a watch kept, a night survived. The watchman feels all of it at once as he waits for his relief, leaning on the sunlit wall, watching the day take the world. And the wall itself passes now from its night self to its day self. To the dark, it belonged to the small band of the watch, the sleepless few holding the empty stretches against the danger that, on this night, as on almost every night, never came. Now, in the growing light, it fills again with the life of the day. The work gangs coming up to their endless mending, the carriers with their loads, the officers on their daylight rounds, the whole busy, visible life of the frontier starting up again in the sun. The signal fires that spoke to each other across the dark are damped and set ready for the next night. The lamps are put out. The night's long, quiet vigil folds away into the ordinary bustle of the day, its record noted, its nothing happened duly logged, and the great machine of the frontier turns over into another day. We began this night at dusk, watching the last light leave the wall, and we've crossed the whole of the dark together, through the lighting of the lamps and the changing of the watches, through the deep cold stretch of the small hours and out the far side into the dawn. We've looked at the men and their families, the fires and the signals, the weapons and the food, the horses and the trade, the stars and the spirits, the whole small world of the wall by night. And now, as the sun climbs and the watch ends, there's nothing left to do but let it go, the way the watchman lets it go, handing the wall on to the day and turning at last toward rest. If you're still awake, let this be the moment you follow him down into the warmth and the quiet, into sleep. The night is over. The watch was kept. The wall stands, as it stood before this night and as it will stand after, grey and huge and enduring along the spine of the mountains, holding the frontier through the dark so that the world behind it can sleep. And now it's your turn to sleep as the watchman sleeps, his long night behind him, the sun warm at last on the old stone, the whole cold, beautiful frontier quiet in the morning light. Rest now. The wall keeps its watch without you. Good night.